Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today, where we are going to be introducing the Advanced and Indirect Mitigation platform and what this project is going to look like. My name is Verena Radulovic. I am the Vice President for Business Engagement here at C2ES. C2ES is a nonprofit climate think tank where we work with a number of different stakeholders, including companies in the Fortune 500, to come up with climate and energy solutions. I am joined here today by my colleagues on this particular effort, Kim Carnahan, who is CEO of Neoteric Climate and Energy, as well as Owen Hewlett, who is the Chief Technical Officer for the Gold Standard. And together, we are, our organizations are launching the Advanced and Indirect Mitigation platform. And the reason why we're doing this is really to solve a particular type of problem for leading companies that want to take action to address emissions that are often in their value chain, but where they need credible and widely accepted accounting and reporting guidance to justify the investments that are needed in the critical technologies and solutions for this type of mitigation. In this initiative, where we will be working to develop a methodology and claims guidance to solve for some of these challenges, we will work with businesses and civil society and other leading climate reporting platforms and protocols, including the GHG Protocol and the Science-Based Targets Initiative, to account for, report on, and claim the results of these kinds of investments. So today, we're going to be first joined by Kim, who's going to walk us through what this initiative is about. Then I'm going to have a conversation with two other speakers that we have with us today, Devin Lake, who is the head of net zero strategy at Meta, and Ibrahim Ariazija, who is the senior sustainability manager at Dow. Two very different companies, but are also trying to solve for some of the same challenges. Then I'll turn to Owen. He's going to walk us through how we're structuring AIM and our next steps. And then we'll turn back to Kim to take questions and answers from the audience. So there will be a lot of, hopefully at least 15 minutes in our webinar today to answer questions from the audience. We're going to do this by having you send in your questions throughout. We'll be monitoring them on our side of the chat, and then we'll be able to do our best to address them. We will be recording this webinar, and it will be available on our website. So if you've missed it or want to share it with teammates, please do so afterwards. So with that, I'm going to turn to Kim, who's going to lead us in the conversation about what this is all about.
Thank you so much, Verena. I'm very, very happy to be here today. I guess I'll just start by saying among this crowd, it probably goes without saying that the Science-Based Targets Initiative has done an outstanding job convincing companies to set really ambitious targets. Over 2,000 today, representing a third of global market capitalization. And thank goodness for that, because we are woefully off track when it comes to raising the private finance that we need to keep warming well below 2 degrees. That's why implementing Scope 3 targets in particular is so important right now. The concept that it's a company's responsibility to work to address each of the pieces of their business model, even though they don't have operational control, is really a game changer. It means that companies are starting to think much harder about how they can contribute to decarbonizing, in particular, the hardest to abate sectors, deep in their value chain that frankly need help the most. And it represents massive untapped potential to scale private climate finance and aim it towards true sectoral transition. And yet the progress that we're seeing so far in value chain decarbonization is negligible. Unfortunately, decarbonizing value chains is really, really hard. The idea that companies can simply cascade their own ambition down their supply chain, frankly, just hasn't borne great fruit so far. Convincing a supplier to take on a science-based target is a slow and sensitive process and unlikely to enable the achievement of near-term goals. So one-on-one engagement with suppliers, with value chain participants is key. But the sheer number of suppliers can be overwhelming. And as I just mentioned, most companies don't have great visibility deep in their supply chain where their emissions hotspots lie, let alone the types of relationships conducive to complicated decarbonization partnerships. Plenty of suppliers are simply unwilling to engage, and their concerns aren't trivial. The changes needed require operational upheaval and often substantial new investments. That's why successful supply chain partnership opportunities are going to be limited, because the technology costs, the solution costs associated with many of the most necessary value chain interventions are very high today. And when companies do manage to develop those partnerships, they face very real challenges associated with having a dynamic supply chain. Their suppliers shift and they risk having to start over. They also face the challenge that the technology, the solution that they found in one part of the world may simply not be available in another part. This is a lot. And the reality is that most large corporations probably face all of these challenges at the same time. And yet those challenges aren't insurmountable. We're not here to talk about how hard it is. Plenty of companies are working very hard to address those challenges now. But there is one challenge that is standing in the way of growing the types of partnerships that can overcome all of that. The barrier to progress right now is the lack of consensus guidance on whether, how, and when companies can claim the impacts of the actions they're taking to reduce emissions in their value chain. This lack of guidance is a problem for two big reasons. First, companies have set targets that no reasonable or unreasonable amount of work would enable them to meet. This obviously impacts their incentive to keep trying to do so. But second, and frankly, more importantly, that we are painfully under-incentivizing companies to spend their money in service of sectoral transition. Now, some of you might be thinking that you've heard of various sectoral initiatives that recognize this problem and are currently developing their own approaches to accounting, reporting, and claiming reductions from value chain activities in their sector. And it's true, I run one of them. It's called the Sustainable Aviation Buyers Alliance. But the proliferation of sector-specific guidance is important for a few reasons. First, it's been crucial to ensuring that investments in some of the hardest-to-abate sectors haven't just stopped. And second, many, maybe all sectors will require sector-specific guidance to get into the weeds of accounting for their particular technologies or their particular approaches to collective mitigation action, for those things that actually make them unique. But addressing this problem sector by sector ignores the fact that it actually stems from a single defining feature of corporate greenhouse gas standards, the almost exclusive use of attributional accounting. And this affects all sectors equally. Attributional accounting requires the use of data that's based on a physical relationship with the reporting entity, or where such data isn't available, average data from the region of that entity. These are default emissions factors most of you are probably very familiar with. This is a problem for indirect emission reductions like those occurring in a value chain, because greenhouse gas inventories today based on attributional accounting are unlikely to capture the results of these critical interventions in a company's value chain. This includes the impacts of a company's support for low carbon commodities representing hotspots in its value chain, like sustainable aviation fuel, like green steel. It impacts the impacts of a project resulting from a sector, an economic activity, and an emission source within your value chain. So for example, support to upgrade boilers within a potential tier 3 supplier. And then finally, it actually impacts also the ability to take credit for the results of directives that a company gives to its tier 1 supplier specifically. This might be telling a tier 1 supplier, don't fly for me anymore. We want to get a separate emissions factor from you so that we aren't responsible for your aviation emissions because we don't need you to travel. The rules for that even aren't clear. So this is our shared challenge across sectors, and one that we can solve together. As you likely all know, the GHG protocol has actually dabbled in permitting a deviation from attributional accounting for allowing the use of market-based accounting for scope 2 emissions from electricity generation. The intention of this experiment was to impact behavior and drive change in the amount of renewable energy generated. There are significant differences of opinion today on whether and how much allowing RECs has grown the market for renewable energy. But the question that needs to be answered is much more complicated than whether or not we just expand that specific approach to all sectors. A more nuanced approach can be developed, learning from those experiences, as well as from the varied approaches being piloted now. And we'll hear from our panelists about a few of those soon. I think the important thing to know, again, is that we can address this problem for all sectors at the same time. And we look forward to sharing our plans for doing that after the panel. Back over to you, Verena.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kim. With that, I'd like to invite Devin and Ibrahim to turn their cameras on. We will get into a conversation. Thank you both very much for joining us today. Just for our audience, why don't I, Devin, let you introduce yourself and what you do at Meta, and then Ibrahim, I'll ask you to do the same for Dow before we kick things off. Devin.
Great. Devin Lake. I am the head of net zero strategy at Meta, which means I'm responsible for collaborating with teams across the country, across the company to reduce our emissions in line with our reduction target.
Great. And Ibrahim?
Hi, everybody. My name is Ibrahim. I'm with Dow as a senior sustainability manager, where I act as a technical advisor to our climate project management office and all things related to carbon accounting and corporate and the product level.
Great. Well, why don't we dive in? And Devin, I'm going to start with you. If you can tell us a little bit about how Meta is thinking about its value chain emissions and how it's approaching it, and give us an example of what some of the challenges are that you're facing that Kim may have alluded to.
Yeah, no, happy to. So at Meta, like with most companies, we are a reductions first program. So we're really focused on across all of our scopes, reducing our emissions. And to do that, many of the challenges I think that Kim spoke to have really become very clear and present, especially as we work towards a 2030 target. So in particular, while a relatively manageable, you could say, group of suppliers represents the majority of our emissions, when you actually look at those suppliers and their their scope 1 and 2 emissions, it's actually a pretty small fraction of what we need to do to deliver on the ambitious reductions that we're aiming for. So because of that, we took a different way of looking at our scope 3, which was to say, if you take all of the EEIO LCA factors, if you take our actual LCAs that we've done for our products, and you reduce those down to, at the end, a few drivers of emissions: fuel, electricity, land use, fugitive emissions, and a few others, you can kind of get this kind of reduced view of here's what we're really going after. As we work with our suppliers, as we work with our internal teams, we've worked to say, here are the portion of those emissions that we think we can address through the decisions we make differently as a business, or those that we can collaborate with our suppliers on. And there's still a lot left. And so what we've done is to say, how can we start to think about how Meta can play a role in helping to reduce those emissions as well, recognizing that we may not know where they come from. Maybe they're many tiers back. Maybe they're from our long tail of suppliers. Maybe they're from a commodity that there's not enough traceability to be able to say, great, we did this project and we can trace it through to our inventory. But we don't want to let those challenges, especially in the near term, get in the way of playing our part to help invest in the technologies that are needed and be part of helping to build those markets and help transition those sectors. So to make that more specific, one of the areas that you might not associate directly with Meta's a top source of Meta's value chain emissions is ground transportation. But when you look at it from this all the way back into the value chain view, there's a lot of ground transportation that comes into place, not just us trucking our hardware, but all of our suppliers using ground transportation and their suppliers using ground transportation and so forth. As we started to think about what could our role be, we've decided to kind of do some pilots in this area. So we're really at the conversation stage right now, but we've started to talk to some ground transport providers, both those that we work with and those that we could work with, or potentially our suppliers work with, and say, how can we collaborate with you to help drive decarbonization efforts? So for example, talking to asset owning, transport company to say, are there plans that you have to electrify your fleets, but you need collaboration to be able to actually get those projects started? There's a lot of risk to those early projects. There's a significant green premium. So how can we partner with you to electrify trucks, to explore green hydrogen alternatives, actually getting new trucks out on the road, thinking about the charging infrastructure, moving forward a lot of that thinking, and Meta collaborating with those partners. That's an example of the kind of work that we want to be doing throughout our value chain, and one of the reasons why we're really excited about this initiative, to help give us guidance around how we can credibly participate in those types of activities.
Great. I just want to kind of pull on this thread that I'm hearing from you, Devin, and just maybe for the audience here, in that there are emissions in your supply chain, but if you're just to tackle those emissions that are attributed to Meta, it might make a little impact, but it wouldn't have the catalytic impact that you're seeking as part of your net zero strategy. Am I capturing that correctly?
I think a little bit different in that, I think the I've actually been reading a lot about the term, attributional and, allocated, however we want to define it. The emissions that Meta is responsible for that have been allocated to us are actually many tiers back. What we don't have is visibility into those. So the ones that we can track from a particular tier 1 supplier, to your point, are a relatively small portion of what we have taken responsibility for in our scope 3 and have been allocated to us in the way that the accounting is done to date.
But the idea is that you want to have an additional catalytic impact in making the solution
apologies.
where it counts.
Yeah, we think that there's a real opportunity to do both, right? One, I think one of the, scope 3 is in one way sort of an exercise in double counting responsibility or many counting responsibility, right? And so we share responsibility for those emissions. We want to take action, and we're excited about the fact that there's ways to take action on helping decarbonize the sectors that we support and also doing that in a way that addresses some of these hard to abate sectors challenges. So I think there's a nice overlap between what those sectors need to transition and the ways in which Meta, can relate to collaborating with those sector partners.
So I want to turn in a moment here to Ibrahim, because I think what Devin, I'm hearing also is what a lot of companies down the value chain or kind of from the customer and customer standpoint face, which is when they look all the way throughout their supply chains, they realize that a lot of the big emissions are happening in these hard to abate sectors that are many, many tiers back, where there isn't necessarily as easy visibility into reducing them. So we're in a really exciting time where companies down the value chain want to have an impact and effect throughout their tiers, even the ones that are all the way back. Ibrahim, I'm going to turn to you now, because you are representing a company that is in the tiers that are all the way back, where Dow makes many, many different kinds of products, and it's in a sector that has a substantial amount of emissions. And yet many of your products, once they get to the end customer, the impacts of making the product may be very different and very diffuse. So from a different perspective, so if Meta is on the downstream end, if I can maybe position Dow a bit in the upstream side, although not always. I'll turn to you and ask the same question. What are some of the ways that Dow is thinking about its emissions, particularly from its position as sort of more upstream in the value chain? And what are some of the challenges that Dow is facing, either in its own value chain or in response to some of its customer requests?
Yes, Verena. So Kim actually put it very nicely that, we have ambitious recognized brands in sustainability of our customers, that they have scope 3 or signed up to SBTi of targets, and the delivery of those targets, when they look into it, it ends up being a couple of the hotspots in the upstream. So some of our customers, again, they also are recognized brands in sustainability, are asking us for lower carbon products, so they can deliver, especially to their near-term greenhouse gas emission targets. Now, by 2050, if everybody's carbon neutral, by then there's not much to talk about it, and everybody already, has a low carbon product. But in the material sectors, for us to deliver for that near-term targets to our customers, in the material sector where Dow operates, the product carbon footprints, if you look at them, that's what they use in the carbon in the scope 3 accounting. Those product carbon footprints are usually concentrated in a few upstream processes. One of the examples is steam cracking, and we make building blocks in a steam cracking, which turn into make all types of products. And that goes into the sectors like packaging, automotive, construction, hygiene sector, just to name a few. And we use a lot of energy and burn a lot of fuel to make this product. We also use additional energy for other part of the process, and we generate our own energy. So as Dow, we said, we are first a reduction based company as well. We have a scope 1, 2 down to zero emission target. And a lot of those investments that we do, they are capital intensive, and those are in the steam cracking and the energy production assets. So once in the next decade, when we started to achieve those deep cuts in our processes, what happens is that those emissions get diluted down to thousands of products that we make. And those thousands of products go into so many different markets. And you will have markets that are willing to pay a premium for that, and there will be markets that are not. So if we go out to our customers saying that I had achieved in the next decade by 10% or a smaller amount of reduction in all our portfolio of products, then it's not very attractive. But what is attractive is that if I can get those reductions concentrated in a small portfolio of products in a flexible carbon accounting mechanism, so I can actually, as a company, we can collaborate and bring our downstream customers who have ambitious targets to collaborate with us to speed up and catalyze this transition to a lower carbon economy.
Still on mute. I want to dive into this a little bit more before I turn to Owen to kind of walk us through, because I think it's worth spending a bit of time here. Devin, I'll turn back to you. Why do we need an accounting and a claims process to capture this kind of information? Why do companies need this? May seem obvious, but I think it's worth teasing it out from your perspective.
Yeah, no, it's a big question, but I mean, the simple version is that, especially as a company with a 2030 target, though all companies who are setting science-based targets have very near-term greenhouse gas reduction goals associated with those, and many for scope 3, that we need guidance to inform us on where we can credibly make investments that are going to be that are going to be credible ways to address the responsibility that we've taken. Sometimes I hear the word sort of, well, we need to make sure we get credit. And that sounds a little funny, but really what we're saying is, we want to be doing this in a very credible way that addresses the responsibility that we have. And to be able to do that, that requires work that would happen outside of greenhouse gas accounting in terms of being able to actually have measurement protocols that really make sure that we're measuring the emissions associated with the projects that we're doing. So it doesn't all sit in necessarily the sort of,
Right.
Accounting space. We often talk about wanting clarity on how to measure, account, and claim. But on the accounting piece, we really know that that there's, and I think there's a lot of open questions, obviously, around sort of how the scope 3 guidance can be interpreted. But when we sit down, for example, and work with, I'll give you this example of our trucking company. This is what we're actually working with a tier 1 supplier that we're talking to and saying, hey, can we decarbonize the business that we do with you? And it's tiny. And they're saying, well, based on the geography that you're in, based on the topography, based on the, existing infrastructure, like there's nothing we can do on your particular trucks, but we can go work on these trucks. And so when we think about that in our minds, that's a near-term decarbonization opportunity we want to participate in, but we're not clear how to have that accounted for in our scope 3 inventory. And so as I think about working with my colleagues to develop a strategy that we can go to our leadership and say, these are the projects that are going to be impactful for one, but also credible. We need guidance from the accounting standards on what those can be. And what is really important is we need that guidance very, very quickly, right? These projects development timelines are 2, 3, 4 years, even for very known technology. If you back that out and you think about the time it takes to collaborate with partners on a new concept, and the guidance that we need is needed really, really quickly. And that's one of the reasons we're really excited about this effort and everything that's going on in the accounting space right now.
Great, thank you. Ibrahim, I'll turn to you and ask you the same question. Why is this kind of an approach necessary from the point of view of Dow and the investments that your company is making?
So the crux of the thing is that we really need to achieve deep cuts in the emissions as soon as possible. 50% by 2030 and carbon neutral by 2050, according to Paris Climate Agreement, to avoid the potential of the climate change. So that early and this kind of a quick of a transition will be unprecedented in human history. So, and this transition comes with additional costs because some of these technologies required are either costly or they're still in development. So there's a risk on, scaling up these technologies. There are incentives in place in some regions like Inflation Reduction Act, which was a fantastic bill in the US, and Green Deal and the European trading system in EU. But the cost of these incentives from the cost of the solutions, some call it a green premium, that usually beyond and to be able to be deployed at a massive scale, really the incentives sometimes are not enough. So that's where I think to achieve this kind of deep cuts, that's where the AIM platform would be really beneficial. Is that if we can set some kind of a mechanism that could bring the leading customer brands with their environmentally conscious customers to the forefront of this transition journey. So we would team up together to generate and catalyze this transition. So that's where you need a market-based accounting mechanism that are credible, that are widely used accepted by standard setters, and the brands who usually have small portion of the product carbon footprint could be able to actually invest in reducing emissions like upstream producers like Dow, so we can put the required investment on the ground to be able to deliver the products that the customers are asking for, because in places there's not enough incentives to do so.
So catalyzing the marketplace, in other words, and speeding it up.
Yep.
Well, let me thank you so much, both of you, for providing that input. What I'd like to do now is turn to Owen Hewlett, who's the Chief Technology Officer at the Gold Standard, our third partner in this effort, to kind of walk us through the structure of how we're thinking of developing this and how we can bring along many different stakeholder perspectives to help shape and develop this so it is a widely developed guidance and accounting process. Owen, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Verena, and hi, everybody. Nice to see a lot of familiar and some very unfamiliar names in the attendees. I'm Owen. I'm the Chief Technical Officer at Gold Standard, and have a lot of expertise, I suppose, in the creation of the kinds of mechanisms we've been talking about here, and we'll come on to some of the background to that in a minute. But as Kim shared right from the offset, the aim here really is to unlock the finance and the energy to be able to address the challenge of value chain decarbonization, which I personally have always felt is the kind of keys to the universe of net zero, given the overlapping and stacked liabilities and responsibilities that are included in that space. So get this right, and a lot of other things fall into place. And to do that, we need to address the difficult things to do. So the indirect stuff, maybe where the accounting game is somehow rigged against you when it comes to the investment game, or where we're talking about stuff that's hard to reach geographically, difficult to reach, limited supply for new technologies, whatever the barrier is, we're really looking in that difficult to do space. And I think Devon said it really nicely. Credibility, legitimacy is needed. Nobody wants to be, as an organization, wants to be out ahead of this curve and then found to be doing something uncredible and being criticized for it. Because if there's one thing that kills CEOs and boards' willingness to invest, it'll be that. And so what we want to do is create that legitimacy and that credibility, and also that consistency of approach through guidance and through close coordination with a number of efforts that already exist, and then the infrastructure around that, and always mindful of complementing the excellent work of SBTi. And trying to push that elephant through the door all in one go is going to be very difficult, and so we will take a phased approach here and focus on those cross-cutting norms and principles in year one, and then start to further supplement that, overlapping somewhat, but start to supplement that with the spin-off guidance, if you like, with our partners, and working with them and individual road testing projects, and also looking at some of the infrastructure that would need to exist to make sense of the tracking around all of these things. Those kind of overlaying responsibilities come with challenges for tracking. And one question that I think we get quite a lot in the start of this initiative is, what about all of the other initiatives that are working in this space? And my observation, having started one of those, the Value Change Initiative, and Kim likewise, a leader at SABA, is that a lot of those initiatives addressing these questions are sector or maybe taxonomically, categories of the greenhouse gas protocol specific. So in Value Change, we were very much looking at Scope 3, Category 1 and related categories in agriculture and apparel and beyond. In SABA, obviously, it's sustainable aviation fuel. And what you quickly realize is we're all saying sort of similar things, similar principles need to be addressed, but using more sector-specific language. And so we want this to be a conversation. We want to find those ways of expressing those principles in a normative language that can then be taken back into those initiatives to align around. And there's some good actors, the ones on the screen, and we know, I'm sure all of you could probably think of more dubious actors out there that are maybe rushing ahead and aren't so strong. So we in part want to help the credible align and become really legitimate and unlock the potential, and the less credible to see that there's a normative curve happening here that they need to get aligned with themselves. So it's worth being a little bit specific about what that actually looks like and what those two things do. And to give you an example, there's some examples on the screen, but to give you an example from my world and the Value Change Initiative, one of the things we looked at there, one of the challenges was around supplier traceability. So what happens if you can trace to a region of producers or a landscape of producers, but you can't trace any further? Maybe you're in a developing country, maybe they're smallholders. What do you do then? Because do you have to work with all of them? That's not so easy to do or to justify as an investment. It is the ultimate answer, but stepping stones will be important. And so we came up with the concept of supply shed, which when can you assume within a boundary, and how do you do it to invest in those producers and as Devon said, be able to be assigned the benefit for reporting. And that supply shed concept, if you reverse engineer it back to a generic concept, is something like, to do that, it needs to be associated with your value chain. Now, associated with your value chain in the world of Scope 2, often means things like grid connection. In the world of fuel, it's something else. In the world of agriculture, it's something else. So you can see an example there of a kind of bottom up. This is a good way of thinking about this problem, but is quite sector specific. It means something specific to those people that we want to reverse engineer back to a generic principle that all those initiatives can benefit from, and then get out of the way of the experts in those sectors to do their job. Right? We don't want all the experts for every sector under one roof. That would be an enormous roof. So we want to make sure those initiatives really get the clarity and then the freedom to be able to deliver credibility in their spaces. That needs to be reflected in both governance and partnerships. So the organisers there at the top, we've already talked about, as have we talked about the complementarity with SBTI and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and others. So, a how to their what, if you like, but we also want to reflect that in the AIM governance. So the governing committee, which will be a decision-making body on those cross-cutting principles and criteria at one level, but with an iterative feedback loop between that and what we've originally called working groups here, but an ongoing discussion about those working groups being some of those initiatives. So rather than reinventing that wheel, can we work directly with those initiatives and iterate back and forth? So to give you an example, associated with supply chain, is that clear enough? Is that too restrictive for some of those initiatives? That's what we need to iterate back and forth. And then obviously not every sector or area of the scope has a really prominent initiative, and we can start to either align with the ones that are emerging or find new ones. And so with that, let me pass back to Kim to discuss some of the logistics of that.
Yeah, thanks, Owen. No, I think you said it very well. We're very focused on working with organizations that are already active in this space and limiting any extra work that might be required of them to kind of engage with us and make sure that their viewpoints are taken into account. So like Owen said, we're having a number of discussions, certainly with the group that you saw listed on the slide before, but really with kind of well over a dozen groups right now who we kind of consider to be strategic strategic partners in this process. And our goal would be to either work with them to get the feedback from their existing working groups, or else bring their members into our working groups as it works best for them. So trying to meet folks where they are already, because so much work has already started, and we certainly don't want to disrupt that and slow any progress down that's being made already in those sector specific groups. And just maybe one last thought here. We are kind of sharing with you a bit of a timeline for how we're moving forward. Obviously, right now we've had a launch which took place earlier in February, and you can go to our website, which is aimplatform.org, and sign up either to participate in a sectoral working group, or if you're interested in having your organization be one of our strategic partners, feel free to go and check that out there. We'd be happy to have one-on-one calls with anybody who's interested. We've also had a special call with kind of our nonprofit partners already to kind of get them a little bit deeper into the weeds on our process. We'll be doing a similar call for private sector folks that are interested in engaging as well in the next couple of weeks. And then our first governing committee meeting is also coming up soon, with working group meetings starting in full force in April. So hoping to do what Devin asked us to do and get us that guidance finished relatively soon. The devil's always in the details. So our goal is to finish this first round of guidance by November. We'll also have to, just work with the progress that we're able to make with all of those groups that we need to make sure that we're able to take their views on board. But please do go and check out the website and sign up if you're interested. Even if you're not sure if this makes sense for your organization, reach out, and we're happy to have a chat and make sure that we're just being as inclusive as possible in this process, without fully slowing down our ability to take decisions on a relatively fast clip. With that, I think we will go ahead and turn to a series of questions. I know some of you guys have already been asking questions in the chat, and we want to make sure that we're getting to those. I can ask all of our panelists to turn their cameras on, and we can go to the questions that we see now. I will start. Owen, I feel like you always get the hardest questions, but we've heard this one a lot, so I know that you're ready to answer it. One of the audience members asked how the AIM platform interacts with the VCI, with the gold standards value chain intervention guidance. I think you spoke a bit to that more, but maybe you can be a little bit more pointed.
Yeah, so VCI, the Value Change Initiative, is something we founded maybe 4 or 5 years ago now, and has been a really successful innovation space, peer-to-peer learning space for primarily agriculture and apparel, but with a lot of ideas that expand beyond that. And one of the things that I observed as we got more and more mature and had more and more detail around it was that it was looking for it had the same need that kind of Devin alluded to from the company side. What do we click into here to make this legitimate and normalized, so that and at the time the intent was to look at built on greenhouse gas protocol status. So there's a status under the greenhouse gas protocol where third-party guidance is in some way endorsed. But the more we looked at that, the more we felt that actually, at least I felt, the greenhouse gas protocol is quite an important thing to stand alone and be focused on inventory accounting and whatever comes next with their forthcoming surveys, which people should check out, by the way. And actually the drive here is more about the setting of a target and the incentives and the challenges that inherently brings. And so, what's the saying, create the content you want to read, right? So we looked at this and we need to create this thing if it doesn't already exist. So the relationship is very much reciprocal. AIM will be looking at a certain level that crosses all of these different initiatives, certainly doesn't displace what VCI is doing. If anything, it gives VCI the proper legitimate home it needs, and gives it the space to develop the detailed criteria that space, or those spaces I referenced, really need.
Great, thanks, Owen. There's another question here, and I think I'll probably take that one, or a couple of questions together related to our interaction with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and kind of what we're seeing in terms of their interest, I guess. And yes, we are collaborating with SBTI and GHGP behind the scenes. We expect that they will be joining a lot of our calls and meetings of the governing committee. We have heard certainly from a lot of folks out there that they've seen a lot of reluctance from those bodies to open up to the kinds of solutions we're talking about. I would say that we have not been seeing that reluctance. We see that there is a real recognition of a problem that needs to be addressed here. And as I said a minute ago, the devil's just in the details. I think there's a lot of interest in making sure that any solution to the problem companies face in, I'm going to use the word that Devin didn't like, but taking credit for the reductions that they're incentivizing in their value chain, that there's a lot of interest in making sure that as companies are also getting clarity on how to do that, that the guidance is driving towards true sectoral transition. So it's not the solution that we're seeking through this effort, and the solution I think that will that GHGP and SBTI will be comfortable supporting is one that does both. It both provides direction towards sectoral transition, as well as helping companies find clear and credible ways to address their targets. So it's not one or the other; it's both. And with that, I think that we'll see a lot of great interaction with those two bodies. Maybe for the next question, Devin, I'll go to you. How might the collaborative support that Meta could provide help a company in a completely different sector? So for example, heavy-duty logistics, that's a particular question we've gotten, and they've asked, what is Meta's value-added role in that type of a partnership?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And we're still figuring it out. And one of the reasons that we're really excited about this partnership is to work together to figure this out, right? So there's both the work that the AIM platform will be doing to figure out the sort of taxonomy and guidance, but also to ideally have more corporate partners to collaborate with as we figure out what are the right ways for Meta and others to add value. In particular, for example, around the heavy duty logistics, the thought might be, and what we're discussing is, could Meta actually pay part of the green premium for a set of vehicles, electric or hydrogen. Obviously, there's need to be support around the fueling or the charging as well, but actually for a period of time, collaborate from a financial perspective on investing in a project together. And we would take the sort of scope 3 credit, you could say, and then that partner would take the scope 1 credit.
Very good. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. We have a lot of good questions and I'm kind of working my way through them now. I would say another question that makes sense to ask would be, could we speak a little bit more to the role and responsibilities of strategic partners in this process? And I think the kind of easy answer to that one is that we're working it out with each strategic partner as we go. The most important thing is that if they have existing working groups of either private sector entities, nonprofit entities, philanthropies, standards, that they get those, that they get the feedback of those groups that they already have working to us as we are developing this guidance. So we see the process of developing the guidance as iterative. And so as we're putting out different iterations, maybe, for example, starting just with looking at the use cases that we want to make sure that we're addressing, we want to make sure that we're addressing all the use cases that are of most importance to the groups that are already very active in this space. So we'll be asking for feedback on our archetypal use cases that we're going through. We then will be looking at different options for accounting, for example, and we'll want to make sure that we're not missing any options that are already being piloted out there. So we'll be asking those kinds of questions of our strategic partners and getting their feedback, not just of the organizations themselves, but really hoping to get a little bit deeper, working with some of the members of those organizations as well. Perhaps another question that would make sense is to answer right now is, will AIM's working groups move forward concurrently or sequentially? And how do groups benefit from the learnings of other AIM sectoral working groups? That's an excellent question. I would say we would assume everything is moving forward concurrently, but that there will also be cross-sectoral working groups where it makes sense to do so. For example, some sectors, even though they are quite different in their operation, will share an intervention approach. So the easiest one available to my brain right now is book and claim. Some sectors that are quite different from each other, it'll make sense for both of them to potentially use a book and claim approach. And so if we were to move forward developing guidance related to book and claim, then we would need to hear the views of those sectors, and it would make sense to bring together calls where we could hear those views together, and that the working group members could actually hear the views of others from other sectors. So we definitely definitely see the need for cross-sectoral working groups as we get a little bit further down the process. Coming back to another question here for someone else, by enabling value chain emission reductions for leaders, there's a question about whether or not it will make it harder for companies that aren't leaders to achieve their own credible value chain reductions. Oh, and I wonder if you see any concerns there about helping, move the Metas in the world across, or the Dows of the world forward. Are we doing anything that might be hurting companies that are perhaps not as far along their journey?
I mean, I think we have to be careful of all perverse effects, and we'll certainly be treating that question with care as we go. You could also make the argument that providing the toolbox makes it easier to make the leap in the first place. So I'm not sure it's necessarily a blanket yes or no. Like a yes or no to that question. I think to me, the more important perverse outcome is to make sure this isn't an initiative where we're trying to find a way for companies to win their individual battle and claim net zero, but we end up still losing the war, right? This isn't a shortcut. It's a way of it's a careful balancing between, incentive and, in the end, we still need all of the average emissions factors to come down, right? That's still going to be true if you're going to get to net zero. So I think we do have to be careful of perverse incentives. Is it favoring one group over another? Are we providing shortcuts where we shouldn't? But I think we'll be mindful of that. I don't think I'm not sure those are binary answers. I think we just have to tread with care all the way through.
And if I can just add to what Owen saying, I think what is really exciting about this work is it enables companies across sectors to, I think as Devin said it well, justify the investments as to where the impact will be the greatest. So we know that there are companies that most leading companies today have a net zero target by 2050, and they have interim targets. There are companies that are looking to be good followers. And so by creating another pathway where companies can take action on climate, maybe they're not ready to set a net zero target, but maybe they're ready to make a significant investment in their value chain that will have a very big impact. This approach can enable those kinds of interventions as well. We see it coming from the leaders, but from those that are good followers, there could be options here as well.
Thanks, Verena. I think the next question would go back to Owen and Verena as well. One of our listeners said, in some value chains, there are debates about who would be able to claim emission reductions or removals associated with a particular intervention. Not just can the company where the emission reductions removals lies also claim it. So can the scope 1 and the scope 3 emitter claim it, but perhaps there are multiple scope 3 emitters involved. Owen, maybe I can turn to you to say, what do you see as the risks of double counting, and how does this question relate to the work that AIM is going to be doing?
Yeah, I think again, one of those valid questions around how do you mitigate perverse outcomes. And I think generally the idea will be that we look for the general high quality principle that meets the specific questions and issues being faced by those various initiatives. But I fully expect that in some sectors, in some parts of the taxonomy, there'll be an issue that is only relevant to them. And, we don't necessarily need a general principle, we need a specific solution, and we keep minds open. I think another example would be, the investments category versus category 1 of scope 3, for example. How does a financial institution, is that an okay double count? There's those kind of things that we need to think really carefully about. As I say, the watchword is we aren't providing, shortcuts, we are providing something. So, double counting will be right at the top of our mind, as it will be in relation to things like voluntary carbon markets, which the Greenhouse Gas Protocol addressed in its land guidance, where you don't want companies achieving their value chain targets and then offsetting themselves with the same benefit, right? You start to end up in this really kind of grotesque place if you don't take care of double counting. So double counting will, of all forms, will certainly form a principle, but I do expect there will be some very point specific ones in different sectors and different parts of the taxonomy.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Verena, anything that you wanted to add here?
No, I think that just that some of the challenges around, if somebody makes a scope 1 reduction, can you claim it for scope 3? Yes. But I think one thing that does come to mind is a temporal aspect of this as we look to accelerate solutions. The reason why we're doing this, and I think highlighting the points that both Devin and Ibrahim raised, we need actions and we need technologies to scale fast. And so how long can an investment or a green premium payment count before that technology has scaled and becomes mainstream? So these are all issues that we have the benefit of looking in the rearview mirror of some of the questions that the last decade has raised in the use of solutions, both physical and market-based, have provided. And so how do we take those learnings and apply them to really advance solutions that lead to outcomes fast in the next couple of years?
Yeah, great. Maybe one more question for Meta. This is a pretty long question, so I'll just read it. Is the idea that you're separating out the components of the life cycle emissions factor and a scope 3 category to identify the primary sources of emissions across the full value chain, and then taking action to directly reduce from that source rather than taking action directly within or across your value chain? So maybe another way to say that is, are you actually tracing the reduction, through your value chain all the way through to the truck that's carrying a good related to Meta? Or are you kind of doing the math of working through your value chain and figuring out how much trucking is there and then trying to address like that big chunk of reductions?
Yeah, I would say we're trying it all in a way, right? And so, I mean, and I think that's part of why I'm excited about guidance like this, is because we would love to spend a good portion of our time on data collection, pushing for transparency, but also an increasing portion of our near-term time focused on investing in reduction solutions, whether that's directly with a supplier and partnering with them to help build their capacity, or with a value chain partner in a more, sort of novel way. And so one of the reasons that we've done, we have a very active program to collect data directly from our suppliers, to get that emissions allocated and start to figure out what we can do to partner there. And we're also doing additional analysis to figure out how can we get some directional guidance around the types of projects that would be relevant to addressing our value chain in this more indirect way. And in particular, where can those types of projects have the most broad impact in terms of sectoral transition and driving new solutions? And we're hoping that we can start to, eventually the data will get good enough that this will sort of marry up, but that's not going to be for a while. And we want to be in the solutions game for the most part, and the data game in parallel, waiting for them to converge.
Makes sense. Okay, next question. Actually, I'll ask Verena, and then Owen, if you want to add anything on as the standard within this the organizer group. The question is about the role of standards in this initiative and whether or not we are welcoming other standards to participate. Are they planning to participate? And yeah, how is that going so far? Verena, do you want to take that one?
Yes, we do have some standards organizations as part of the governing committee, and always keeping a keen view out to how can we harmonize standards? One of the things that we're trying to do in this effort is be filling a gap, but filling a gap with a very clear and sensitivity to the other standards that are out there. One thing here at C2ES that is really important to us is, how do we create pathways for companies to take action? And when you have a lot of different kinds of standards that don't speak to each other or reference each other, that just creates confusion in the marketplace. And so to the extent that we can, and this is, I think, alluding to Kim, what you mentioned earlier, bringing in the protocol, bringing in SBTI, and we have others that we're connecting to, and Owen can speak to that a bit more, to make sure that there is a harmonized web, a harmonized system out there that talks to each other and that is aligned to make it as easy as possible for companies to take collective action. I don't know, Owen, if you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, very much so. I think that there's different standard systems. There's the commodity focused and there's the more impact focused, like gold standard. I think there's room in the tent for everybody. This isn't meant to be a competitive space. It's meant to be an enabling.
Yeah, good. And now, Owen, I'll stick with you. Actually, folks have also asked, how is what we're doing different than like ICBCM or other kind of leadership focused work related to carbon offsets? Why are we doing something different? Why aren't we just, shepherding everybody towards carbon offsets?
Yeah, look, I think, ICVCM as an initiative, I think is, some of the ways it's thought about things like the core carbon principles is a useful comparison, and we'll look at the way they've done it and see what can be learned there. And I think there's almost certainly some crossover ideas, but there's a long list of reasons why the greenhouse gas protocol and science-based targets don't accept offsetting and the use of credits against inventories and towards targets in value chains, that we can't really unpack in 3 or 4 minutes, unfortunately. But for example, the emission reduction metric alone is a relative metric. So you could reduce 100,000 emissions. Is that good, bad, or don't know when it comes to decarbonizing a supply chain, where you need to think also in absolute terms. So it's just not an instrument that alone can offer us the keys to the universe, to use my old phrase from earlier in the presentation, right? But there's a heap of technical reasons. Additionality would be another one. Is that always necessary in value chains? I think sometimes it will be, if we're making claims where we're not necessarily sure if that's your precise producer, and that's the kind of thing that can incentivize you towards aggressive decarbonization. But to impose it unilaterally, I don't think that's the right answer either. So certainly some stuff to be learned, but offsetting is not the right mechanism for value chains.
Yeah, makes sense. One question, I'll start with Ibrahim, and then Devin, if you have anything to add, please do. One of the folks is asking, what are the outcomes by which you measure yourself internally? I know we talked about certainly just, measuring based on your inventory, or perhaps reductions that you're able to take credit for in or outside of your inventory. But are there any other ways in which you're trying to take stock of the work that you're doing here? Is it solely emissions based?
So the reductions that we achieve in our scope 1, we would like to be, collaborate with our customers so they can claim those reductions that are directly through the purchase of our products in their scope 3. So this way they would enable the transition for us to invest into, the new technologies. And again, I want to just put a point here, is that Dow, supports an economy-wide carbon pricing mechanism, which is not part of this AIM platform. And that is still lacking in some places. So that's where I think the AIM platform is really important for us to develop the mechanism. So if you need additional financial incentives to decarbonize, then you are able to get them through the customer pull from the market pull.
Very good. Anything to add, Devin?
No, I mean, just to be clear, so emissions is the foundation of how we make these decisions, right, about generating credible reductions. That said, of course, many of the other opportunities and positive sort of like additional benefits, whether it's on the social side, other environmental benefits, and this sort of idea of where can we play our part to help this sectoral transition are certainly areas where we're helping us prioritize. But at the end of the day, if it's not going to generate a credible emissions reduction that we feel, is managing and safeguarding against the concerns that have rightly been brought up here, that's going to be our ultimate decider.
Thank you. We have just like 1 moment left, so I'll try to kind of quickly answer a few of the quick questions. Someone asked, what does the technology working group cover? It covers tech companies. So companies like Meta could participate in that one, but also Microsoft, Amazon, et cetera. So I'm just using some examples there. What would the producer taking the scope 1 credit report if it is selling the scope 3 credit, or if a scope 3 emitter is supporting the investments that lead to the scope 3 credit? I think that is exactly one of the questions that our group will be answering. So we don't presume that we have the solutions to all of these things yet. Certainly we have ideas, but that's the point of the work, is to answer that kind of question. And then a few folks have asked, who are the groups we're most interested in engaging? And to be honest, I mean, apart from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the Science-Based Targets Initiative, who are clearly key to our work, frankly, it's anybody who's active in this space and has been acting as a leader trying to drive sectoral transition. So that's a good segue to the final thing I'll say here, which is please do visit our website if you are interested as an individual or as an organization. Please sign up, and we're happy to have, again, one-on-one conversations with you or integrate you into the working groups as it makes sense. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a lovely day, and we will see you guys in the process. Thanks a lot.